The beer bottle slipped from Kevin's hand, shattering against the hardwood floor with a sharp, wet crack. The room, already buzzing with the low hum of conversation and the clink of glasses, fell silent. All eyes turned to him, but Kevin barely registered the mess at his feet. His focus was locked on Kimberly, standing across the room in that crimson dress she'd bought 2 weeks ago. The one she'd insisted was for networking. "Oh, come on, Kevin," she said, her voice dripping with mockery, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You can't honestly expect me to be impressed with your heroic firefighter paycheck. I mean, really, how many times can you save a kitten from a tree before it stops being cute?" Her laughter cut through the air like glass, sharp and unrelenting. It wasn't the first time she'd made a jab at his job, but this was different. This was calculated, public, and designed to humiliate. Kevin's chest tightened as he scanned the room. The other firefighters, his brothers in arms, shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting away. Some of their wives exchanged glances, their pitying smiles making his skin crawl. And then there was Jake. Their son, barely 16, sat slumped in a corner, his hoodie pulled low over his face. Kevin could see the way Jake's shoulders hunched, his fingers gripping the edge of the table like he was trying to disappear into it. The kid had been quiet all night, but now his discomfort was palpable. Kimberly wasn't done. She took a sip of her wine, her crimson lips curling into a smirk. "I mean, let's be honest, Kevin. You're not exactly climbing the corporate ladder, are you? What's your big plan? Retire at 60 with a medal and a pension that won't even cover the cost of a decent vacation?" The room felt like it was closing in. The smell of spilled beer mixed with the faint scent of charred wood from the fireplace, a reminder of the charity run they'd all just finished. Kevin had been proud of that run, of the community coming together to support the station. But now, standing there with shards of glass at his feet and his wife's cruelty ringing in his ears, it all felt hollow. He wanted to say something, to fire back, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he caught Jake's eye across the room. The kid looked up for just a moment, his gaze flickering with something, embarrassment, anger, maybe even a flicker of solidarity, before he dropped his head again. Kimberly's laughter followed Kevin as he turned and walked out, the crunch of broken glass beneath his boots the only sound in the heavy silence. The cold night air hit him like a slap, but it was a welcome relief after the suffocating heat of the room. He leaned against the hood of his truck, staring up at the dark sky, the faint glow of the moon obscured by clouds. He didn't know it yet, but this was the moment everything started to unravel. The cracks had been there for a while, hidden beneath the surface, but tonight they were out in the open, jagged and raw. And as he stood there, the faint sound of the party still drifting through the open door, Kevin felt the first real stirrings of anger. Not at Kimberly, not yet, but at himself, for letting it get this far. The house was too quiet. Kevin sat on the edge of Jake's bed, the faint hum of the ceiling fan cutting through the silence. His son stood in the doorway, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his hoodie. Kevin could see the tension in Jake's shoulders, the way his jaw clenched and unclenched like he was chewing on words he didn't want to say. "What's going on, bud?" Kevin asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. He didn't want Kimberly to hear. Not yet. Not until he knew what was eating at his kid. Jake hesitated, his eyes darting to the hallway and back. He looked younger than 16 in that moment, like the little boy who used to crawl into Kevin's lap after a nightmare. Finally, he pulled something from his pocket. A crumpled piece of paper, edges frayed and creased like it had been folded and unfolded a dozen times. He held it out, his hand trembling slightly. Kevin took it, his fingers brushing against Jake's. The paper felt heavy, like it carried more weight than it should. He smoothed it out against his thigh, the glow of his phone screen casting a pale light over the text. It was a receipt, a hotel receipt, the kind of place Kimberly would call overpriced and pretentious. And there it was, her name printed neat and clear at the top. The date stamped below it made his stomach twist. Last Thursday. His 24-hour shift. "Where'd you get this?" Kevin asked, his voice tight. Jake looked down, scuffing his sneaker against the carpet. "I found it in Mom's purse. I wasn't snooping, I swear. I needed money for lunch and I thought she wouldn't mind. But then I saw it. And..." He broke off, his voice cracking. "Dad, She's been lying to you. For months. Kevin stared at the receipt, the numbers and dates blurring together. His chest felt like it was caving in, but he forced himself to breathe, to stay calm. What else, Jake? Jake hesitated again, then pulled out his phone. He tapped the screen a few times before handing it over. Kevin squinted at the brightness, his heart pounding as he scrolled through the messages. They were between Kimberly and someone named Brad. A sponsor, she'd called him, some rich guy funding her daycare expansion. But the messages weren't about business. Not even close. Can't wait to see you again, Brad had written. Same place as last time? Kimberly's reply, of course. Just make sure you bring the champagne this time. Kevin's hands tightened around the phone. He felt like he was falling, like the ground had vanished beneath him. He wanted to scream, to throw something, to demand answers. But he just sat there, staring at the screen, the words blurring together as his vision swam. I didn't know how to tell you, Jake said, his voice small. I didn't want to hurt you. Kevin looked up at his son, his throat tight. You didn't hurt me, Jake. You didn't. He reached out, pulling Jake into a hug. The kid stiffened at first, then melted against him, his shoulders shaking as he finally let himself cry. Kevin held him, his mind racing. The receipt, the messages, the lies. It all added up to something he didn't want to face, something he couldn't ignore. But for now, he just held his son, the glow of the phone screen casting long shadows across the room. The truth was out there, waiting for him. And he knew deep down that nothing would ever be the same. The kitchen felt smaller than usual, the air thick with the smell of burnt garlic from dinner and the faint tang of red wine. Kevin stood by the counter, his fingers tapping nervously against the edge of the granite. He could hear the rhythmic ticking of the clock above the sink, each second stretching longer than the last. Kimberly sat at the table, her crimson nails gripping the stem of her wine glass like it was the only thing keeping her upright. The glass was half empty or half full, depending on how you looked at it. But Kevin wasn't in the mood for optimism. You've been lying to me, he said finally, his voice low but steady. He slid the receipt Jake had given him across the table. It landed just shy of her wine glass, the crisp white paper a stark contrast to the dark wood. Kimberly didn't look at it. Instead, she took a slow sip of wine, her eyes narrowing as she set the glass down with deliberate precision. What is this, Kevin? Another one of your paranoid fantasies. Her tone was sharp, but there was a flicker of something in her voice. Hesitation, maybe, or guilt. It's a receipt for a hotel room, he said, his jaw tightening. From last month, during my 24-hour shift. Care to explain? She laughed. A short, brittle sound that didn't reach her eyes. You're really reaching now. I told you Brad and I were working on securing funding for the daycare. He's a busy man, Kevin. Sometimes meetings run late, and we have to meet at odd locations. Is that a crime? Kevin's chest tightened. He wanted to believe her. God, he wanted to. But the evidence was right there, staring him in the face. He pulled out his phone and opened the text messages Jake had shown him. And these? You expect me to believe these are just about funding? Can't wait to see you. Kimberly? That doesn't sound like business. Her face flushed, a deep red creeping up her neck. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the tile floor. You're being ridiculous. You've always been so insecure, Kevin. Always looking for something to be wrong. Maybe if you spent less time at the fire station and more time here, you wouldn't have to invent problems to justify your absence. Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He'd heard that argument before, but this time it felt different. This time it wasn't just about him. It was about her, about them, about everything they'd built, or at least everything he thought they'd built. This isn't about me, he said, his voice rising. This is about you, about what you've been doing behind my back. Don't turn this around on me, Kimberly. Don't you dare. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words seemed to catch in her throat. For a moment, she just stood there, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Then, without another word, she grabbed her purse from the counter and stormed out of the kitchen. The front door slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing through the house like a gunshot. Kevin stood there, staring at the empty space where she'd been. The ticking of the clock seemed louder now, each second a reminder of the silence she'd left behind. He looked down at the receipt, the numbers and dates blurring as his vision swam. The half-empty wine glass sat abandoned on the table, the deep red liquid catching the light like a warning. He sank into the chair she'd vacated, the weight of everything pressing down on him. The kitchen, once a place of warmth and connection, now felt cold and alien. The smell of burnt garlic lingered, a bitter reminder of the life they'd shared, and the life that was crumbling around him. For the first time in years, Kevin felt truly alone. And as he sat there, staring at the empty wine glass and the ticking clock, he realized something he'd been ignoring for far too long. This wasn't just about Kimberly. This was about him, about who he was, and about who he needed to be. Kevin sat in the fire station's lounge, staring at the photo of their family on his phone. The happy smiles now felt like a cruel joke. His fellow firefighters noticed his silence but said nothing. The room was filled with the familiar sounds of the station, the clinking of coffee mugs, the low hum of the TV in the corner, and the occasional crackle of the dispatch radio. But to Kevin, it all felt distant, like he was underwater, everything muffled and out of reach. He swiped through the photos on his phone, stopping on one from last summer. They were at the beach, Kimberly laughing as she held onto her wide-brimmed hat, Jake grinning with a sandcastle shovel in hand. Kevin had been the one behind the camera capturing the moment. Now it felt like a scene from someone else's life. He zoomed in on Kimberly's face, searching for some hint of the truth he now knew. Had she been lying even then? Was that laugh real or just another performance? The coffee in his mug had gone cold, but he sipped it anyway, the bitterness grounding him. He thought about the late nights she'd claimed were for fundraising meetings. The way she'd come home smelling faintly of perfume that wasn't hers. At the time, he'd brushed it off, trusting her. Now, the memories felt like puzzle pieces clicking into place, forming a picture he didn't want to see. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a text from Jake. "Hey Dad, you okay?" Kevin stared at the screen, his thumb hovering over the keyboard. How could he even begin to explain this to his son? He settled on a simple reply, "Yeah, just busy at the station. Talk later." But he wasn't okay. He couldn't shake the image of Jake's face at the charity run, the way he'd looked at the floor while Kimberly had torn into Kevin in front of everyone. Jake had known something was wrong long before Kevin had. The realization gnawed at him. How many nights had Jake spent listening to their arguments, carrying the weight of Kimberly's lies? Kevin stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. He needed to do something, anything, to keep from drowning in his thoughts. He grabbed his keys and headed for the door, ignoring the curious glances from the guys. The night air was cool, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the station. He climbed into his truck and just sat there for a moment, staring at the dashboard. The fire station was his sanctuary, a place where things made sense. Here, there were rules, protocols, a clear line between right and wrong. Out there, in the world Kimberly had created, nothing was as it seemed. He started the engine, the rumble of the truck calming him. He wasn't sure where he was going, but he knew he couldn't sit still anymore. As he drove, the city lights blurred past, each one a fleeting reminder of the life he thought he'd built. He found himself pulling into the parking lot of the daycare Kimberly had been so passionate about. The building was dark, the playground empty. He sat there, staring at the swings swaying gently in the breeze, and wondered how much of this place was real. His phone buzzed again, this time with a notification from their joint bank account. Kimberly had made another withdrawal. $500, labeled, supplies. His jaw tightened. Supplies for what? Another hotel room? Another dinner with Brad? He opened the app, scrolling through the recent transactions. The numbers didn't add up. There were deposits he didn't recognize, withdrawals for things he knew they hadn't bought. It was all there, right in front of him, and yet he'd been too blind to see it. Kevin clenched the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. He wanted to scream, to punch something, to make the world make sense again. But he didn't. Instead, he took a deep breath and started the truck. He wasn't going to let her destroy him. Not anymore. As he drove back to the station, the sound of distant sirens filled the air. It was a call he wasn't on, but the familiar wail was a reminder of why he did what he did. He wasn't just fighting fires, he was fighting for his life, for Jake's life, and he wasn't going to let Kimberly burn it all down. Back at the station, He grabbed a fresh cup of coffee and sat down at the table. He pulled out a notebook and started writing, jotting down dates, amounts, and names. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He didn't know where this would lead, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to stop until he had the truth. Kevin sat at the kitchen table, the glow of his laptop screen casting harsh shadows across the room. The smell of burnt coffee from the pot he'd forgotten about hours ago lingered in the air, bitter and acrid, like the thoughts swirling in his head. The bank statements were spread out in front of him, each one a paper trail of betrayal. He'd started combing through them after Jake's revelation, his hands trembling as he clicked through their joint account history. At first, he'd told himself it was nothing, just a few discrepancies, maybe an error. But the numbers didn't lie. The first deposit had been easy to overlook. $5,000 dated 3 months ago, right around the time Kimberly had started coming home late, her stories about fundraising meetings growing more elaborate. Then another, and another. The amounts varied, but the pattern was clear. Every time Kimberly had been out of town or working late, a deposit appeared in her personal account. Kevin's stomach churned as he matched the dates to her calendar, the one she'd left open on her iPad. Trips to Chicago, New York, Miami, always for daycare sponsorships, always with Brad. He'd found the key to her locked desk drawer in her jewelry box, tucked beneath a pair of diamond earrings he didn't recognize. The drawer had been stuffed with receipts, designer handbags, spa weekends, dinners at restaurants he couldn't afford on his firefighter's salary. And there, at the bottom, a ledger, neatly handwritten, meticulous in its deception. Transfers from their joint account, marked as business expenses. Withdrawals from her personal account, spent on things she'd never mentioned. A $10,000 Chanel bag, a weekend at a 5-star resort, a first-class ticket to Paris. Kevin's hands clenched into fists, the edges of the bank statements crumpling under his grip. He thought of the sacrifices he'd made. The overtime shifts, the missed birthdays, the nights he'd spent at the station while she'd been out living a life he couldn't even imagine. And all the while, she'd been lying to him, using him, draining their savings to fund her double life. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway snapped him back to reality. He quickly gathered the papers, shoving them into a folder and tucking it under the table. Kimberly's heels clicked against the pavement, her laughter drifting through the open window. She was on the phone, her tone light and flirtatious. Kevin's chest tightened as he listened. The words, business meeting, and Brad, floating through the air. When she walked in, her face lit up with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Hey, babe," she said, setting her designer handbag on the counter. "Long day. You wouldn't believe the meeting I just had. Brad's really stepping up to support the daycare. We're talking major funding." Kevin forced a smile, his jaw tight. "That's great," he said, his voice flat. "Sounds like you've been busy." "Oh, you have no idea," she said, pouring herself a glass of wine. "It's exhausting, but worth it. For the kids, you know? For the kids." The words felt like a punch to the gut. Kevin stared at her, the woman he'd loved for over 20 years, and wondered how he'd never seen it before. The way her eyes darted away when she lied, the way she twisted the truth to fit her narrative. She was a stranger now, someone he didn't recognize. As she chattered on about her plans for the daycare, Kevin reached for the folder beneath the table, his fingers brushing against the edge. He didn't confront her, not yet. He needed more. He needed to be sure. But as he watched her sip her wine, the bitter taste of betrayal settled in his mouth, and he knew one thing for certain. The life they'd built together was crumbling, piece by piece, and there was no way to put it back together. Kevin stood in the polished lobby of Brad's high-rise office building, his work boots scuffing the marble floor as he waited. The receptionist had eyed him warily when he walked in, his firefighter uniform out of place among the tailored suits and designer heels. He didn't care. He wasn't here to blend in. He was here to end this. The elevator doors slid open, and a young assistant in a pencil skirt gestured for him to follow. "Mr. Thompson will see you now," she said, her voice clipped. Kevin nodded, his jaw tight. He followed her down a hallway lined with glass walls, the city skyline stretching out like a glittering mirage beyond the windows. It was the kind of view that screamed money, power, and entitlement. Kevin hated everything about it. Brad's office was at the end of the hall, A cavernous space filled with leather furniture and abstract art that looked like it cost more than Kevin's annual salary. Brad himself sat behind a massive oak desk, his gold-plated pen twirling between his fingers like a prop. He didn't stand when Kevin entered. "Kevin," Brad said, his tone dripping with false cheer. "This is a surprise. What brings you all the way up here?" Kevin didn't sit. He didn't bother with small talk. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a manila folder, slapping it down on Brad's desk. The sound echoed through the room like a gunshot. "Cut the crap, Brad," Kevin said, his voice low but steady. "I know what you've been doing with Kimberly, and I know you've been funneling money into her account under the guise of sponsoring her daycare. That stops now." Brad's smile faltered, but he recovered quickly, leaning back in his chair like he was untouchable. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his tone dismissive. "Kimberly and I have a professional relationship. Nothing more." Kevin's hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he kept his voice calm. "Professional? Is that what you call it when you book luxury hotel rooms during my 24-hour shifts? Or when you buy her designer bags and jewelry? You think I'm stupid, Brad? I've seen the receipts. I've read the texts. You've been playing house with my wife, and it ends today." Brad's face flushed, his smug mask cracking. He set the pen down and leaned forward, his voice sharp. "You're out of your depth here, Kevin. You think you can walk into my office and make demands? You're a firefighter, for Christ's sake. What are you going to do? Hose me down?" Kevin didn't flinch. He reached into his pocket again and pulled out a small, worn badge, his firefighter badge, and set it on the desk next to the folder. "This badge means something," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "It means I don't back down. It means I don't let people like you get away with screwing over the people I care about. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to cut ties with Kimberly. You're going to stop funding her little side projects. And if you don't, I'll make sure everyone in the city knows exactly how you've been supporting her business. How do you think that's going to look for your reputation, Brad? Philanthropist by day, homewrecker by night." Brad's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking to the badge on the desk. For a moment, the room was silent, the hum of the air conditioner the only sound. Then Brad leaned back again, his face a mask of forced indifference. "Fine," he said, his voice clipped. "I'll cut her off. But this isn't over, Kevin. You don't get to come into my world and throw your weight around." Kevin picked up his badge and slid it back into his pocket. "It's over for you," he said, turning to leave. "And if you ever come near my family again, I won't be this polite." He walked out without looking back, the weight of the confrontation still heavy on his shoulders. The elevator ride down was quiet, the city skyline fading from view as the doors closed. Kevin didn't feel victorious. He felt tired, but he'd done what he came to do. Now it was time to face the next battle. Kimberly's key turned in the lock, the sound sharp and familiar, but everything else about the moment felt foreign. She stepped inside, her heels clicking against the hardwood, only to freeze when she saw the stacks of moving boxes lining the hallway. Her designer handbag slipped from her shoulder, hitting the floor with a dull thud. Kevin stood in the living room, his arms crossed, the faint smell of smoke from the fireplace clinging to the air like a ghost of better days. "What the hell is this?" she demanded, her voice rising. But there was a crack in it, a faint tremor that betrayed her panic. Her eyes darted to the boxes, each one labeled in Kevin's neat, blocky handwriting. Kitchen, bedroom, office. The labels were clinical, impersonal, like he was cataloging the remains of a life she'd already burned to the ground. "You've got until morning to leave," Kevin said, his voice steady, but his eyes, those damned eyes, glistened under the dim light of the chandelier. He didn't yell. He didn't even raise his voice. That was the thing about Kevin. He didn't need to. His quiet resolve was more cutting than any scream. Kimberly took a step forward, her heels crunching on a stray piece of packing tape. "You can't just kick me out," she snapped, her voice climbing an octave. "This is my house too." "Not anymore," Kevin said, his tone flat. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a folded stack of papers, holding them out like a shield. "I filed for divorce this afternoon. The lawyer has everything, the bank statements, the receipts, the texts. It's over, Kim." Her face flushed, a deep, angry red that spread from her cheeks to her neck. She snatched the papers from his hand, her nails scratching against his skin, but he didn't flinch. She scanned the first page, her lips moving silently as she read, and then her eyes widened. You went through my things?" she hissed, crumpling the papers in her fist. "You left me no choice," Kevin said, his voice low but firm. "You lied to me. You lied to Jake. You took everything I worked for and used it to fund your little arrangement." Kimberly's face twisted, her lips curling into a sneer. "Oh, don't act like you're some saint, Kevin. You were never here. Always at the station, always playing hero for everyone but your own family. Did you ever stop to think maybe I needed you too?" Kevin's jaw tightened, and for a moment, the fire in his eyes flared. "Don't," he said, his voice trembling now. "Don't you dare turn this around on me. I was out there risking my life to provide for us, and you—" He broke off, shaking his head. "You threw it all away." She opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. Instead, she turned on her heel and stormed toward the bedroom, her heels clicking furiously against the floor. Kevin didn't follow. He didn't need to. He heard the sharp clatter of hangers in the closet, the slam of drawers, the muffled curses under her breath. She was packing, but not everything. She left behind the things she didn't want. The old photo albums, the mismatched coffee mugs, the sweater he'd bought her last Christmas. The remnants of a life she'd already discarded. When she emerged, dragging a suitcase behind her, her face was streaked with mascara, but her chin was high. "You'll regret this," she said, her voice cold and brittle. "You think you're so righteous, but you're just a fool, Kevin. A fool who couldn't keep his wife happy." He didn't respond. He just stood there, watching as she yanked open the front door, the chilly night air rushing in. She hesitated for a moment, her hand gripping the doorframe, and for a split second he thought she might turn back. But then she stepped outside, her heels clicking down the porch steps, and the door slammed shut behind her. The sound echoed through the empty house, a final, hollow note that seemed to linger in the air. Kevin sank onto the couch, his head in his hands, the faint smell of smoke still clinging to the room. The fireplace had long since gone cold, but the embers of his anger still smoldered, waiting to be reignited. He'd done the right thing. He knew that, but it didn't make the ache in his chest any easier to bear. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and carrying the faint sound of a car engine fading into the distance. Kevin sat there, surrounded by boxes and silence, and wondered how the hell he was supposed to start over. The morning of the charity run dawned with a crispness in the air that felt like a fresh start. Kevin stood near the starting line, adjusting the laces on his worn running shoes. The firefighter banners flapped gently in the breeze, their bright reds and golds catching the sunlight like flames. He could hear the murmurs of the crowd, families, kids with their faces painted, the occasional bark of a dog, but his mind was elsewhere. The weight of the past few months pressed on his chest, but today wasn't about that. Today was about moving forward one step at a time. As the race began, Kevin fell into a steady rhythm, his breath sinking with the pounding of his feet against the pavement. The route wound through the heart of town, past familiar landmarks. The old diner where he and Kimberly used to grab breakfast after night shifts, the park where Jake had taken his first steps, the fire station where he'd spent more hours than he could count. Each one carried a memory, some sweet, others bitter, but he kept running. The sound of other runners' footsteps around him was a strange comfort, a reminder that he wasn't alone. When he crossed the finish line, sweat dripping down his face and his lungs burning, the crowd erupted in applause. For a moment he hesitated, standing there in the middle of the chaos, the noise washing over him like a wave. Then someone handed him a microphone, and he found himself climbing onto the small wooden podium. The sun was warm on his skin, and he squinted out at the sea of faces, some familiar, others not. He cleared his throat, gripping the mic a little too tightly. I don't really know what to say," he began, his voice rough but steady. "This past year has been a lot, but today, seeing all of you here, supporting this cause, it reminds me why we do what we do. It's not about the bad days or the hard nights. It's about showing up, even when it feels like the world's falling apart. It's about being there for each other." The crowd erupted again, and Kevin felt a lump rise in his throat. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, but for once, it didn't feel like a burden. He glanced down at the firefighter banners draped across the stage, the familiar emblem of his station staring back at him. It wasn't just a job. It was who he was. And no matter what Kimberly had done, she couldn't take that away from him. As he stepped down from the podium, a few people clapped him on the back, offering words of encouragement. He nodded, smiling faintly, but his mind was already elsewhere. He scanned the crowd, looking for Jake. When he finally spotted his son near the concession stand, his heart swelled. Jake was wearing that old firefighter hoodie Kevin had given him years ago, the one with the faded logo on the chest. He looked up, caught Kevin's eye, and gave a small, hesitant wave. Kevin made his way over, his legs still aching from the run. "You okay, kid?" he asked, his voice softer now. Jake shrugged, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "Yeah, I'm glad you're doing this, Dad. It's cool." The words were simple, but they hit Kevin harder than he expected. He reached out, ruffling Jake's hair, and for the first time in a long time, Jake didn't pull away. The warmth of the sun on their faces, the distant sound of applause still echoing in the background. It felt like a moment worth holding on to. Not a victory exactly, but something quieter, something real. As they walked back toward the car, Kevin glanced over his shoulder one last time. The banners were still fluttering in the breeze, the crowd starting to disperse. He took a deep breath, the smell of fresh-cut grass and hot dogs filling his lungs. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time in months, he felt like he could see the road ahead. And for now, that was enough. The finish line banner fluttered in the breeze, its bright colors a stark contrast to the heaviness Kevin had carried for so long. Jake stood beside him, his firefighter-themed hoodie sleeves pushed up to his elbows, the fabric worn soft from years of wear. The sun spilled over the crowd, warm and forgiving, as if the world itself was offering a moment of peace after the storm. "I'm proud of you, Dad," Jake said, his voice cracking under the weight of emotion. He didn't look at Kevin as he spoke, his gaze fixed on the ground, but his words landed like a punch to the chest. Not the kind that knocks you down, but the kind that reminds you why you're still standing. Kevin reached out, pulling his son into a hug, the kind of embrace that felt like it was years overdue. Jake's shoulders trembled, and for a moment, Kevin thought he might cry. But then Jake pulled back, wiping his face with the back of his hand, and offered a small, crooked smile. "You've been through hell," Jake said, his voice steadier now, "and you're still here, still doing this." He gestured to the banner, to the crowd of runners and firefighters milling about, laughing and swapping stories. I don't know, it's kind of amazing." Kevin didn't know what to say. Words felt inadequate, like trying to hold water in his hands. Instead, he clapped a hand on Jake's shoulder, squeezing tight, and nodded. The warmth of the sun on his face, the sound of laughter around them, the faint smell of grilled burgers wafting from the food tent. It all felt so ordinary, so achingly normal, and yet it was everything. Later, as they sat on the tailgate of Kevin's truck, sharing a bag of pretzels and a couple of lukewarm sodas, Jake finally opened up. "I hated seeing her like that," he admitted, his voice low. "The way she talked to you, the way she, acted like you didn't matter. It made me feel like I didn't matter, too." Kevin's chest tightened. He'd been so focused on his own pain, his own anger, that he hadn't stopped to think about how all of this had been weighing on Jake. "You matter," he said, his voice rough. "More than anything. And I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner. I should have been there for you." Jake shrugged, but Kevin could see the way his jaw clenched, the way his fingers tightened around his soda can. "It's not like you weren't dealing with your own stuff," he said quietly. "But, I don't know. I just felt like I was stuck in the middle, you know? Like I had to choose sides, and I didn't want to. I just wanted my parents to be my parents." Kevin didn't know how to fix that. He couldn't undo the past, couldn't erase the hurt that Kimberly's choices had caused. But he could do better. He could be better. "You don't have to choose," he said finally. "You're my son, and I'm always going to be here for you, no matter what." Jake nodded, his eyes glistening, and for a moment, they just sat there in silence, the weight of everything they'd been through hanging between them. But it wasn't a heavy silence, not anymore. It was the kind of quiet that comes after a storm, when the air feels clean and the world feels new. "I'm glad it's over," Jake said after a while, his voice barely above a whisper. Not just for you. For me, too. Kevin reached over, ruffling Jake's hair the way he used to when Jake was a kid. Me too, buddy, he said. Me too. And for the first time in months, he meant it. Kevin sat on the edge of the fire station's bay doors, his boots scuffed and worn from years of running into places most people ran away from. The sunset bled orange and pink across the sky, the kind of sky that made you think about endings and beginnings at the same time. He sipped lukewarm coffee from a chipped mug, the kind with the fire station logo that had faded after too many trips through the dishwasher. The weight of everything. Kimberly's betrayal, the lies, the way she'd twisted their life into something unrecognizable, still sat heavy in his chest. But it wasn't crushing him anymore. It was just there, like a scar he'd learned to live with. The distant wail of a fire truck echoed through the quiet streets, a sound that had once been a call to action but now felt like a reminder of the life he'd chosen. A life built on duty and loyalty, even when it wasn't returned. He thought about the nights he'd spent here, the guys who'd become his second family, the way they'd shown up for him without question when everything fell apart. They hadn't asked for details, just handed him a beer and let him talk when he was ready. Or not. That was the thing about firefighters. They knew when to push and when to just sit in the silence. He glanced down at his phone, the screen dark. No calls from Kimberly. No texts from Brad. Just a photo of Jake from the charity run last week. His son's face flushed with pride as he'd crossed the finish line. Kevin had hung back, letting Jake have his moment, but the way his boy had looked at him afterward, like he was seeing his dad for the first time in years, had cracked something open in Kevin's chest. He wasn't just a guy who put out fires anymore. He was someone his kid could look up to again. The station's bay doors creaked as the wind picked up, carrying the faint smell of smoke from somewhere in the distance. It wasn't a fire, just someone burning leaves or maybe cooking dinner. The kind of smoke that didn't need him. He liked that, liked the idea that not every problem required his attention. Liked the thought that maybe, just maybe, he could start focusing on the things that mattered, his job, his son, the quiet moments like this one. He stood, stretching the stiffness out of his legs. The sun had dipped below the horizon now, leaving the sky a deep, bruised purple. The fire truck siren faded into the distance, and the station fell into its usual hum of low conversation and the occasional burst of laughter. Kevin lingered for a moment, his hand resting on the doorframe. He didn't know what came next, not really. But for the first time in years, he wasn't scared of the unknown. He'd faced worse, and he'd come out the other side. As he turned to head back inside, the station's lights flickered on, casting long shadows across the bay. The guys were gearing up for the night shift, their voices carrying the kind of easy camaraderie that came from years of trusting each other with their lives. Kevin grabbed his jacket from the hook by the door, the fabric still smelling faintly of smoke and sweat. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let anyone take this life from him again. Not Kimberly. Not Brad. Not anyone. For the first time in a long time, Kevin felt like himself. And that was enough.